We all have that friend who wakes up early to go get everyone McDonald's breakfast, while the rest of us sleep in. This is your sign to thank them. And if you're that friend, this is us saying thank you.
Just a friendly reminder that right now, get any size iced coffee before 11 a.m. for just 99 cents. And a satisfying sausage McMuffin with egg is just $2.79. Price and participation may vary. Cannot be combined with any other offer or combo meal.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
I'm Stephen Metcalf, and this is the Slate Culture Gabfest. Ryan Gosling falls for Emily Blunt edition. It's Wednesday, May 8th, 2024. On today's show, The Fall Guy is an action thriller rom-com. It kicks off the summer movie season. It stars Ryan Gosling as a stuntman, Emily Blunt as a Hollywood director who, well, I mean, you kind of know the rest. Anyway, they fall in love on and on. It's directed by David Leitch, a former stuntman himself. And then the feature film, I Saw the TV Glow, is a micro-budgeted indie that's getting a lot of attention. It's part tone poem, part parable about the fluid lines of fandom and identity. It's directed by Jane Schoenbrun. And finally, we discuss the student protests with Lydia Polgreen of the New York Times. But first, joining me today is Julia Turner. Julia is a fellow at the Annenberg School of Journalism at USC. Julia, hey.
Hello, Steve.
And of course, Dana Stevens is the film critic for Slate. Dana, hello.
Hello, Steve.
All right, let's make a show. The Fall Guy was a throwaway TV show from the 1980s. That didn't stop it from serving as IP for this year's kickoff to the summer blockbuster season. This movie stars Ryan Gosling as Colt Seavers, a veteran stuntman who's fallen for Jody, a camera woman on the set at the beginning of the film. She's played by Emily Blunt. After a horrible mishap, Colt abandons both the relationship and his career as a stunt double. But Jody's now getting her shot to direct a big-budgeted blockbuster for which Colt comes out of retirement. Many rom-com and action hijinks ensue. It also stars Hannah Waddington of Ted Lasso fame. It's directed by David Leitch. He's of John Wick fame, though that's interesting. You didn't get credit for that first movie, but he co-directed it. He did direct and was credited for directing Atomic Blonde. In the clip, we hear Gosling as Colt reconnecting with Blunt as Jody on the set of her first film as director. He thought that she specifically had asked for him, but it turns out, no. Let's listen.
Why are you here?
I think there's been a misunderstanding.
Clearly.
Because I was under the impression that you did want me here.
That's a delusional thought. We haven't spoken in a year.
I'm happy for you. This whole director thing looks good on you. Even the gardening hat, somehow.
Everyone wears them. It's like a set thing. Okay?
Yeah, I see it. They're not making it look as good as you are. So. And I'm not trying to be flat. I'm just saying the facts. But you look good in everything. You look good in nothing, whatever. No, I don't mean
really?
It like that. But you do look good in nothing.
This isn't going to work.
You do, but it's not what I...
All right, Dana, let me turn to you on this. I mean, it's got a little bit of a get shorty meta thing going on. This is a blockbuster about a blockbuster being made. Of course, it fragments off into action land and rom-com land. Two huge stars, abundance, I think, of charm. What do you think?
I mean, I'm very happy to have this be the first summer movie of summer 2024. I don't know about you guys, but I felt like this was just the movie that I needed at this moment. It doesn't do everything perfectly, but the things that it does get right are so different from your average summer action movie, which is that the central relationship is really good. I mean, this is basically a rom-com with a lot of action set pieces embedded throughout it, but the actual sort of love affair, I guess you would call it, the obstacle-strewn path toward love of the stuntman and director played by Ryan Gosling and Emily Blunt is just so charming and specific and sweet, and we actually know who they are as people, and that is really unusual, I think, in a movie that is sort of, Tom Cruise sized in its action ambitions. In fact, in some ways, the actor played by Aaron Taylor Johnson, who Ryan Gosling's character doubles and is the stunt double for, is a Tom Cruise ripoff, right? I mean, he's supposed to be this big action star who claims he does all his own stunts, when behind the scenes he has this crew of stuntmen doing them for him. So it's sort of a spoof of an inflated show business ego, but the real story is behind the scenes. So if you're a movie nerd who's always sort of wanted to embed on a film set and watch how things get put together behind the scenes, this movie is very telling in that respect. And since it is made by David Leitch, a former stuntman who has doubled for Brad Pitt and others in the past, I get a sense that you really are getting a little bit of a sense of how stunts work in the background. The last thing I'll say before throwing it to you guys is if you do go see The Fall Guy, definitely stay through all of the credits, because they had the very smart idea of putting in the real stuntman. You get to see the guy who actually doubled for Ryan Gosling, or I think there were 5 different stuntmen who doubled for him. So it's a real kind of love letter to stunts and action movies if you sit through the credits.
Julia, I wish you had been with me when I saw this movie at the Nighthawk movie theater in the South Slope in Brooklyn, because as they usually do, they do this long extended supercut of past performances by a star of the movie. I mean, or something related to the movie. Like, they just ransack the archives to come up with these obscure clips. And the one they had for this was of Ryan Gosling going all the way back to his Mouseketeer audition and every phase in between. And by the time it was like, you know how the Grinch's heart grows 3 sizes or whatever it is larger at the end of it. I was just like a throb for Ryan Gosling. And I know you love him. I love him. I just think he's a terrific movie star. Surely that must have pleased you about this movie, if nothing else. You're a huge Gosling fan.
Oh, speaking of Grinch, I didn't love this movie the way I wanted to, which is only probably a testament to how exciting I found the trailer and how fond I am of both Ryan Gosling and Emily Blunt, and how Emily Blunt crashed Ryan Gosling's SNL monologue opener when he hosted a couple weeks back, and they did a very charming performance. And I don't know, I thought this might be one of my favorite movies ever, and I didn't quite feel that it achieved liftoff. And I was trying to think back to the tonal, to other action comedies I've loved, and to try to figure out what it was that felt slightly earthbound about this. My favorite part of it, and the thing that I think it does best, is offer a portrait of life on set of one of these ridiculous mega blockbusters at the moment. Way in which you get to see how stunts are done, how they're pulled off, what's practical, what's green screen, and the kind of staging and flighting of all of that is really fascinating and interesting. And I agree that the romance gets some space and gets a little bit more breathing room. And maybe it's not fair to judge this romance after having watched Challengers last week, but I don't know. The kind of psychological bonds between the two of them seemed a little pat and movie-y to me for the most part. I don't know. Ungrinch me. I wanted to like this so much, and I only liked it kinda.
I think it's a question of expectations. I agree with you completely that both stars are wonderful. Emily Blunt should not get any short shrift here. She is really, really charming in this movie. She does a tremendously good job. She is just such a wonderful comic actress. And I thought their chemistry was terrific, but the bar was set so high by the previews, which made it look like the perfect, big budget Hollywood summer movie, which it just isn't. I mean, the stars are great. There is fun banter. I think some of the jokes really land. I was laughing out loud in the theater. The setup is great. Of course, the stunts are over the top and very fun. The Get Shorty thing kind of works pretty well, especially in regard to the idea that the actual A-list movie star in this movie is charmingly playing the anonymous guy whose face gets scanned so the remarkable things that he does get CGI'd to look like somebody else, right? And it's just a great way to make a movie star seem not like a movie star, so you can venerate him as a movie star. That really worked for me. I thought, oddly enough, every scene in this movie could have just identifiably been cut by 20 to 50%. Like, that was the odd thing to me was you sort of had everything there in the can. And then you get it to 2:05 at 2 hours and 5 minutes, whereas at 1 hour and 50 it might have sung a little more with exactly the film that I saw. You could literally have cut those 15 minutes out of what I saw without breaking a sweat or making a hard choice. It just, the pacing wasn't quite tight enough, and the whole thing is you're trying to get adrenaline going on the action sequences so they can't be flabby. You're trying to get crackle going in the rom-com banter sequences, and they just need to be zing, 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 and move. It's like pace is the art of the whole thing. So I thought once I'd reset my expectations for the film, once I lowered the bar on it, the great inflation went away. I said, an okay May blockbuster with unsteady legs commercially and artistically, but it's an absolutely great airplane movie. Like, that is a great airplane movie.
Well, according to my theory of airplane movies, almost anything you watch on an airplane is immediately 20% better.
Yes,
so,
exactly.
But I would grade it above an airplane movie. I do completely agree with you on the pacing, and I think that is what makes it feel like a summer movie, right? I mean, it's this sort of the first bloated action movie of 2024. And I agree that 15 minutes could come out of it, just about 15 or 20 minutes. But in my view, all of that would have to come out of the action. And maybe that's just because, as I was saying, I think this seems primarily like a rom-com with action, right? Rather than an action movie with a romance structuring it.
You don't think the giant, stupid split screen convo could go?
I thought that was a great moment. I thought that was a really clever cinematic joke. I think every scene between Ryan Gosling and Emily Blunt should stay. And I wouldn't want this movie to be cut at the expense of scenes like the moment when she catches him listening to Taylor Swift and crying in his car. And then they have this late night car conversation, which was like something out of a romantic drama. You know, it was just the kind of scene that slows down the pace and says, what's happening between these two people? And it's just rare including in romantic comedies, in movies where the two leads are separated, right? And they're in this moment of sort of romantic longing for one another, that they sort of sit down as friends and have a talk about the fact that that's happening, which would happen in real life all the time, but never happens in that kind of movie. So I appreciated that this movie made those gestures. Given that it was directed by somebody who, as Steve said, worked on the John Wick movies, made the movie Bullet Train last year, which I thought it completely did not work as an action movie or a drama, although it was full of amazing stunts. To see that person could make a more intimate and kind of personal film was kind of exciting to me. I would like to see what David Leitch does next, and I would not have said that after seeing his previous few action movies.
I mean, I had a funny feeling coming away about him because the screening I saw had a little intro from him and Ryan Gosling, and then you see him some in the final credit sequence, and the notion of a stuntman who becomes a director and then makes this love letter to stuntman. Like, it's a beautiful story, and he seems like a mensch among mensches. But the list of movies he's made is like clunkerific, you know? So this is not clunky, but like Atomic Blonde, Hobbs and Shaw, nobody's favorite Fast and Furious movie, Bullet Train. Like, you know, I was rooting so much for this. Maybe I just had too high hopes. Maybe you're right, Steve. But I wanted something transcendent because I felt like the potential here was extraordinary, and it was something solid and fine. But even, people keep comparing. I was searching about and trying to think, like, what's the last like action comedy that really nailed the tone? And then I was like, oh, it's the Ryan Gosling. It's The Nice Guys, the movie that Ryan Gosling did with Russell Crowe and Shane Black, which was riotously funny and tight and taut, and just so much more in control of its pitches, I thought.
I agree with that. Still, I had a lot of fun. All right, well, the movie's The Fall Guy, starring Gosling and Blunt, and it's out there wide. It kind of wobbled a little bit at the box office. It won the weekend, but it's not by historical standards, a great kickoff to the summer. I continue to believe people should go to movie theaters. You almost always have a rewarding, fun experience there. I say check this one out. All right, let's move on.
As a stuntman, he's certainly a smasher. Though any second might well prove to be his last. He'll try anything once. If he survives, no doubt he'll be ready to repeat the performance.
This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Most of you listening to this show right now are probably multitasking in some way or another. You might be driving, cleaning, exercising, maybe grocery shopping. But as long as you're not in some kind of moving vehicle, there's something else you could be doing right now, and that's getting an auto quote from Progressive Insurance. It's easy, and you can save money by doing it right now from your phone. Drivers who save by switching to Progressive save nearly $750 on average, and auto customers qualify for an average of 7 discounts. Discounts for having multiple vehicles on your policy, being a homeowner, and more. So just like your favorite podcast, Progressive will be with you 24/7, 365 days a year, so you're protected no matter what. Multitask right now. Quote your car insurance at Progressive.com to join the over 28 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $744 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2022 and May 2023. Potential savings will vary. Discounts not available in all states and situations. Apple Card is the perfect cashback rewards credit card. You earn up to 3% daily cash on every purchase every day. That's 3% on all your favorite products at Apple, 2% on all other Apple Card with Apple Pay purchases, and 1% on anything you buy with your titanium Apple Card or virtual card number. Visit apple.co/card calculator to see how much you can earn. Apple Card issued by Goldman Sachs Bank USA, Salt Lake City branch. Subject to credit approval. Terms apply.
All right, now is the moment in our podcast when we discuss business. Dana, what do we have?
Stephen, the business this week is just to tell you about our Slate Plus segment. At Julia's suggestion this week, we're going to talk about man versus bear. There was a TikTok that went viral last week and caused a lot of discussion that was positing the idea that it's less dangerous and frightening to be left alone or confronted by a bear than by a random man on the street. This led to a lot of discussion about gendered violence and about the statistical likelihood of attack by a man versus a bear. It also, maybe to some extent, flattened out a really important question into a little moment of viral discourse. But it seemed to us like an interesting enough moment that we thought we'd take it on ourselves. Man versus bear, which would you rather be left alone with? If you're a Slate Plus member, you'll hear us talk about that at the end of the show. And if you're not, you can always become one by going to slate.com/culture plus. What do you get in exchange for being a Slate Plus member? You get unlimited access to all of the writing and podcasting on Slate. You get bonus content like the segment I just described. And of course, you support the magazine, all of our work and all of the work of our colleagues. These memberships are really what keeps Slate going. So please, if you haven't already, sign up today at slate.com/culture plus. Okay, Steve, on with the show.
I saw The TV Glows, the second feature film from writer-director Jane Schoenbrun. It follows the story of a moody, tentative friendship between two kids, Owen, who's in 7th grade when the movie starts, and Maddy, who's 2 years older. They get deeply into a TV show called The Pink Opaque. It's vaguely similar to Buffy, I suppose, but the touchstones of Buffy fandom are all there in this movie. There's chapter and verse completism, endless need to hash over and rehash the canon. Over time, what's real and what's in the TV show begin to blur somewhat disturbingly. The film stars Bridget Lundy Payne and Justice Smith as the two protagonists. In the scene we're about to hear, the two protagonists have moved on. They're now both in high school, and Owen would like to rekindle their friendship and start watching the TV show again.
If you wanted, I could come over again. I've been watching the tapes you've been making me, but I wanted to watch the Pink Opaque on Saturday night again while it airs.
I like girls, you know that, right? I'm not into boys.
Totally, that's fine.
Okay, I'm just making sure. What about you? Do you like girls?
I don't know.
Boys?
I think that I like TV shows.
All right, well, since we're doing 2 movies this week, Julia, I'll start with you on this one. What did you make of this film?
There is so much to admire in this movie, and it is excruciating to watch because it is about a feeling of depressive claustrophobia. And, you know, I think there are several critics who've read it as an allegory for the experience of being trans. It's certainly a portrait of teenage alienation. and maybe just lifelong overall depressive alienation. And as much as Luca Guadagnino wanted us all to have a terrific rip-roaring time watching Challengers and thinking about how fun and tense and sexy life can be, this is a movie that wants to dunk you in an opposite set of feelings about how bleak and empty and perplexing and numb life can be. I was really blown away by the imaginativeness of the storytelling, and in particular by Emma Portner, who's a wonderful dancer who I've been able to see dance in person out here in Los Angeles, but who plays and embodies the Mr. Melancholy, who is the big bad of the Pink Opaque, and also Mr. Melancholy's various henchmen. And when I saw her name in the credits, I was like, oh, that explains why all those Buffy villains were such good dancers. And that I mentioned that not because it's that performance or the dancers specifically, but on a modest budget to make such visually unusual and imaginative choices, and to be able to make pretty lo-fi effects very surreal, memorable, gripping, and compelling was very impressive to me.
Dana, what about you? This is a mood piece saturated in a kind of depressive affect. What'd you take away from it?
Yeah, strangely, in connection with what Julia was just saying, a line from The Fall Guy, the other movie we discussed this week, comes to mind, where there's a moment early on in the movie where Ryan Gosling's character is discussing with the producer of the big budget movie he's about to start work on, that the message, she says, what are the messages of all my movies? What's the message of all my movies? And he says something like, is it that nihilism is a valid worldview or something like that? And she goes on to contest that and say that that's only the apparent message, and that underneath is something much more uplifting. But this movie almost does at times seem, and I don't want to spoil the ending, but it almost does seem at times like a kind of validation of nihilism as a worldview. I mean, I had the word excruciating in my notes from watching, Julia. And at the same time, I have a lot of praise for this movie. Other words that appear in my notes while watching are innovative and exciting filmmaking. It feels like Jane Schoenbrun, who is a trans non-binary person and recognized they were trans somewhere in between their first film, We Are All Going to the World's Fair, and making this one, is working out things on screen. And that had a huge effect on viewers at Sundance. This was rapturously received. Of course, there's a long history of movies being rapturously received at Sundance and other festivals that both don't have a great economic footprint upon their debut and maybe aren't as critically praised. But I think some of the rapture about this one came from the fact that it is operating in this very liminal area that few movies sort of dare to remain in for long, right? I mean, the idea of the premise that there would be two troubled teens who would unite over this strange television show they're both obsessed with feels like something that would be familiar. But the places this movie goes with it are not familiar at all. One of the comparisons that I think has been held up in a lot of the reviews is David Leitch. There's something David Lynchian about this movie's exploration of a zone that isn't quite real, isn't quite fantasy. It's not quite clear to us how this could ever be resolved, right? How the longing of these two protagonists to basically enter a TV show and live in it could ever be resolved in the real world without supernatural elements, which this movie doesn't really suggest exist, but sort of dangles. I know everything I'm saying sounds very vague, but I'm trying not to give anything away. Anyway, I think all of that is really brave and exciting writing and filmmaking, but it doesn't necessarily lend itself to watchability or engagement. I wanted to read something from Amy Nicholson's great review of this movie in the LA Times. She is also ambivalent about it. I think her movie is classified as negative on Rotten Tomatoes, but it didn't read to me as negative. I think this is very, very well stated. She says, on its surface level, however, I saw the TV Glow is just about a mope. Owen's torpor, his froggy, monotone way of talking, his incessant, suppressed discomfort is draining. The film invents a new emotion, passionate ambivalence. Schoenbrun's argument might be that this is exactly the response they're after. They've accomplished it, but at the expense of engagement, resulting in a collection of leaden scenes that might make the audience want to claw out of its own skin. So to have that paragraph in a review that goes on to basically say, it's good that this movie exists and you should probably watch it is a strange thing, but that's sort of the place that this movie left me in.
Well, Dana, I really admired that Nicholson review in the LA Times too, though I perceived it as just totally negative. She says, picking out a particular moment that aggravated the shit out of me, she said, I could have smashed at that moment my own head into the nearest TV, which is, I have to admit, sort of how I felt watching this film. It's so mopey, it's so dreary, it's so slow, it's in a weird way, almost bizarrely underwritten, which it then excuses itself for being by making both characters so suppressed and inchoate and so utterly without social context other than the TV show, which I suppose is on purpose. That's fine. But this is an example of what we used to call in grad school the mimetic fallacy. You can make a movie about boredom. You can make a movie about torpor, about anomie, about the lack of norms and contexts of young, poor suburban kids. You can't make it boring, torporous, contextless, and antisocial to this degree and expect an audience to follow along with you. I don't like being asked to admire something so much that all of my capacity for aesthetic judgment rooted in my own pleasure and how I choose to spend my time are supposed to be obviated because of that admiration. I didn't really admire the film. I have to say that. I thought some of the visuals were somewhat arresting. I otherwise found it repetitive, utterly dull, and pointless. It didn't really move anywhere. It didn't teach me something new about adolescence, pre-adolescence, post-adolescence, life, adulthood, television, fandom, or how perilously vague the line between reality and fiction can be when you're that deeply unhappy with your own life, especially during those formative years. And the thing that drove me nuts is the aggressive lack of humor or wit or spark. So they take no joy in anything they do or say other than the solace and tiny community they find in watching this TV show together. And of course, the show itself. I mean, really, isn't that terrifically insulting to what actual human beings are like? And then the second thing I'd say is that the thing that really put me off the film, and obviously I'm at the extreme end of negative about it, and I think I only got there in the portrait, and I don't want to give anything away, of kind of the afterlife of one of these characters in particular, that is just such an utter falsification of the arc of a human life and adulthood. It's so reductive to a set of cliches about living within a hermetic world defined entirely by the parameters of consumerism, junk culture, a kind of carnivalesque relationship to, in this instance, an arcade, and like adult commitments, right? And then the final thing I'll say is, and Dana, I'm curious to hear you speak to this, is just the utter failure of a tick the movie has, which is a direct-to-camera address on the part of one of the characters that just seems out of place. It's meant to seem like a strong choice. It just seems like a weak one to me, and it added up to the sense of malaise and pointlessness that this film left me with.
Yeah, actually, the direct-to-camera address, specifically just to take that for a minute, I feel like this has become a litany that I've said in so many reviews and probably on so many of these podcasts too, is just direct-to-camera address in a movie is so hard to get right, or a TV show. And it's very, very rare that I think it works. I didn't even think it worked in the first season of Fleabag. The only reason it did in the second season of Fleabag is because the awkwardness of direct address to the camera was sort of incorporated into the trope. But yeah, it completely weighs down this movie. And it's also just very inconsistent. It happens about 3 different times with vast stretches in between.
He can't connect with anybody. Why would he be confiding in us?
Right. Suddenly he's accurately summarizing entire years of his life to the camera when, you know, we've seen that he can only stutter out the barest sentences with anyone else. I mean, I hear what you're saying in relation to the third act of this movie. I think this movie has a huge third act problem that I'm sort of surprised was not flagged at some point in the development process, which is just that whatever kind of ending you're going to have, happy, unhappy, ambivalent, inconclusive, there needs to be movement. You know, there needs to be some sense of like, this is more of an ending and a resolution than the rest. Even The Sopranos, that ends on a black screen, right? It has a feeling of it wants to say something in its resolution. And I don't think that this movie knows what it wants to say in the third act. So I agree that the last 15 to 20 minutes are extremely weak. I do think that there's enough interesting stuff in the first half, especially in the glimpses that we see of the weird TV show they're both obsessed with, and the idea that it's sort of, you know, almost something that they created together in their own minds that didn't really exist on the screen. That's a really interesting idea. And if that had cohered at the end into some sort of thematic statement that made sense with the first 2/3 of the movie, I think I would probably be walking out of it saying this movie is, you know, slow paced. It's not really for me. I think it's a little too mopey, but I see what it's trying to do. And I think it accomplishes that. It's the ending that makes that fall short of happening.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to be in the grips of a movie that seems to want you to admire it more than it wants to cast a spell on you. But you know, I did think as the notion that this film is a trans allegory and a portrait of what it's like to live before what some folks call the egg crack, the moment of recognizing that might be the source of your emotional dislocation. I found that really powerful and arresting, like the stultifying, oppressive nature of that feeling of pervasive wrongness and numbness. I hadn't really seen anything quite like that before, and although I did not enjoy it as a film-going experience, and I hear you about the mimetic fallacy, but I had not seen that before as a film-going experience in quite that way, and the use of the surreal and the magical and the cultural, I don't know, I thought it was a really interesting way of offering that portrait, and I felt glad I had seen it, even if I didn't think it all entirely worked.
I do have one question for Steve. I know there's one moment in this movie you must have liked, which is that Phoebe Bridgers sings an entire song in it.
I loved it. I'm so glad that you flagged that moment. It's Carolyn Polachek is actually singing a song in this. I mean, she's an extraordinary performer and singer in this cabaret style, and it's lurid and weird and kind of wonderful. And then she's joined on harmonies by Phoebe Bridgers, who's also on guitar. And I was like, I love that song by Polachek. I love hearing it. It seems to be being performed live by the two of them in the context of the film. I loved their version. The harmonies sound beautiful. I was like, that was worth it. That was worth the price of admission.
I hear you about the excruciatingness, Steve, but I did think there was a lot to chew over and admire in this film. I mean, briefly, just as a Buffy fan, and probably the biggest Buffy fan on our show, there's so many explicit homages to Buffy fandom. And it was interesting to me because what these characters seem to admire in the Pink Opaque as a Buffy homage, so different than what I loved about Joss Whedon's Buffy, which was not the brooding alienation, but the camaraderie and wisecracking dialogue, the fun, the zip and fun and mischief of it. And so the kind of soggy, sober mythology and the fact that that was what was remembered as the Buffy homage made me think about, I don't know, the difference between being a Buffy fan in your teens and a Buffy fan in your 20s, which is what I was. And then, you know, the other thing that I found really powerful, you know, many critics have spoken of this as a trans allegory, and it's so visually inventive and uses such surprising storytelling choices to convey how oppressive and alienated and numb that feeling of dislocation is, of feeling that you're in the wrong body or self. And I hadn't seen anything like that before, and I found it powerful.
Well, the film is I Saw the TV Glow. It's the second feature from filmmaker Jane Schoenbrun. I was a thumbs down, but I see that it is a singular achievement, and my co-hosts recommend it, so check it out.
Hi there, it's Julia Louis-Dreyfus. You may know me from my podcast called Wiser Than Me, where I talk to older women and get their wisdom from the front lines of life. I was amazed by how many people told me our show made them look forward to getting older, which is why I'm here to talk about season 2 of the show. Sally Field, Billie Jean King, Beverly Johnson, Ina Garten, Bonnie Raitt, just to name a few. All hail old women. Wiser Than Me season 2 is out now from Lemonada Media.
Back in the 90s, Pepsi and Coca-Cola were in a heated race to try and win loyal customers by any means necessary. But when Pepsi launched an ambitious promotion that encouraged people to buy Pepsi and redeem points for prizes, they overlooked their own fine print in a major way. On each episode of Wondery's podcast, The Big Flop, comedians join host Misha Brown to chronicle one of the biggest pop culture fails of all time and try to answer the age-old question, who thought this was a good idea? Like, who at Pepsi thought it would be a good idea to advertise that people could earn enough points to redeem a military jet as a prize? When they launched their Pepsi point system, they never imagined somebody might try to actually snag it, but a 23-year-old did, and suddenly, Pepsi owed him a jet. Follow The Big Flop on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can listen to The Big Flop early and ad-free right now by joining Wondery Plus.
All right. Well, Lydia Polgreen is an opinion columnist for the New York Times. She's also the co-host of the Matter of Opinion podcast for the Times. By a more or less random quirk of timing, Lydia was at the Columbia campus reporting on the protests. Those, of course, are the protests and encampments calling for the Columbia Endowment to divest from Israel and an end to the war in Gaza. She then subwayed back to her office only to discover the president of Columbia had called in the police to clear the encampments. That was on Thursday, April 18th. That Friday, the following day, miraculously, I don't know how anyone hits a deadline that tight, Lydia filed a column that went, I think it's fair to say, viral, and also fair to say that she's become a sane and trusted voice on the significance and nature of the protests. Lydia, welcome to the show. It is really, really great to have you on.
Oh, what a wonderful introduction. Thank you. It's great to be here. Long-time listener, first-time caller.
I am so honored to hear that. I don't think I knew that. That was really, really, really cool. Thanks. Anyway, so just a quote from that column. I think it's from the first column that I'm quoting. You said, as the protests have spread to dozens of campuses and counting, competing viral clips on social media paint vastly different versions of what's happening inside these pro-Palestinian camps. Actually, I think I'm going to quote the whole thing. Are they violent conflict zones filled with militant protesters who hurl anti-Semitic abuse? Is it a giant love fest of students braiding daisy chains and singing Kumbaya? I, Lydia, tried to figure this out the only way I know how, by reporting. Here, and I'm very curious to hear, what has your reporting shown you thus far?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I have a tremendous confidence in reporting, and I think it's an absolutely incredibly important part of capturing reality. But I'm also very conscious of the fact that we all have our own bolt holes into reality, and I just happened, in the happenstance of me happening to be on the campus of Columbia and then happening to come home later that same day, which is, it turns out that I live a block away from One Police Plaza, and One Police Plaza is where all of the protesters who are arrested come and get processed and then released. So I actually saw the protests on kind of both ends, and in fact have been watching and listening to them unfold just right outside my apartment building in New York City. And so, this has been kind of in the atmosphere for me for a while. And I think that feeling of seeing things on social media that don't really match up to your experience, I think, is one that many of us have had, right? Like if you just happen to be near a viral moment when it happens, you just know that what has been captured is like a very, very limited aperture of what's actually going on. And in the case of Columbia, it was clear that there was a real sort of jumbling of what was happening outside the campus gates and what was happening on campus, what was happening among the protesting students who had built these encampments that I saw as being actually like very sort of sweet and, highly organized and disciplined, a little bit cheesy in some ways. There were groups of kids sitting around like analyzing Palestinian poetry and doing teach-ins about anti-Semitism and things like that just didn't match up to like the picture of what we'd all seen, which was, people outside the gates of Columbia essentially yelling, what were clearly anti-Semitic things, but it wasn't clear were these quote unquote outside agitators. So there's just like this whole stew of information that's like hard to parse and pin down. So I sort of felt like my role was to just try and report as honestly and clearly as I could the kaleidoscope of what I was seeing. And, we can get into this later, but among the things that I saw were things that actually did make me feel uncomfortable, and that did sort of make me think like, are these protesters, in different contexts doing things that I think are undermining their cause or could tip into anti-Semitism? So anyway, I just tried to dwell with the complexity of what I was seeing and reflect back accurately based on, my own perceptions and what I know.
I think one thing that's been striking about the conversations around these protests and the coverage of them is the balance between the approach you've taken, which is what is actually going on here. And as with any protest, student or otherwise, what's going on is usually so many different forces at once. Like the whole point of a protest is it's lots of people banding together who all agree on some things, but probably not all things. And then they make a lot of noise in some way or other, visual, actual, whatever. So there are people who want to look at the nuance of that. And then there seem to be so many people in the culture who want to simplify or use the protest to represent any of a number of things, that the young are heedless idiots, that grown-ups are craven cowards, that that the political opinion on one or the other side of the spectrum is heedless and thoughtless and cruel and perhaps racist. Like the ways in which various folks, politicians, commentators, pundits, seem to have been spun into an irrational panic by the protests across campuses across the country is one of the really disheartening things about the coverage and the conversation to me.
Well, there's just so much projection going on, right? I mean, what are universities, right? They're where we put people in whom we invest like our future, right? So, these are places that we care about a lot for very, very good reason, right? It's where all the young people are. It's where they're learning the things that are going to like shape our future. So it makes perfect sense that everybody is going to project their own anxieties and fears and hopes and dreams onto these kids and interpret the actions of these kids, and in some case, the faculty, some of whom have been supporting these protests, they're just going to invest it with just a ton of meaning about kind of where the world is going. And sort of in this time that just feels so polarized and fraught and, where it's just so hard to know where we're going, it actually is just not even in the least bit surprising to see how much is being projected onto these protests.
Yeah, and also there's been a fundamental shift, right? That the primary source of funding for these universities was often federal grants on the science side, tuition, but over the last 30 years, the funder class, the donor class, has become enormously powerful. And we're now talking about people who don't just have tens of millions of dollars, they have, in some cases, $100 billion, and they expect to impose their will on their alma maters as much as they have been on the political democratic processes of the United States. They are purposely putting the presidents of these universities in these vices in order to get them to enact their will, which is to crush and eliminate these protests. It sounds cartoonish, but oddly enough, we live in a world where the cartoon answers almost perfectly to reality. Is that basically a correct characterization?
I think that's definitely what I'm seeing on the ground, and just based on the conversations that I'm having. I had dinner with a group of professors from quite sort of brilliant, celebrated, older, long tenured professors from Columbia and NYU the other night. They feel like they're kind of don't really have any role in any of this, that this is a drama that they have no ability to influence or exert pressure on. But I worry a little bit about how kind of ahistorical our understanding of the university and its role. I was watching the documentary that Steven sent around, Columbia Revolt. I think it was made in 1969, but it was, filmed around the 1968 protests. And it was really striking. And it's kind of a verite style documentary that captures, what was happening inside of Hamilton Hall and other buildings around those protests. We primarily think of those protests as being about the Vietnam War now, but actually they started in part because people were mad about Columbia's expanding footprint in Harlem, and there were Black students who were angry about displacement and gentrification and things like that. But it was just really interesting to hear them talk about things like, Columbia's involvement in the defense industry, the powerful trustees like, Bill Paley, who is the chairman of CBS, and, the role of all of these kind of big, powerful businesses in the affairs of the university. So watching it, I thought, oh, well, plus ça change. This is actually a story that's been with us for a very, very long time. But I think the thing that has really changed is that the administration of universities has really ballooned, and that role of these donors has just become more and more and more important, and more of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then also these, university endowments, particularly for these big elite universities, they're basically these huge hedge funds, and money takes on a logic of its own, and the relentless, seeking of financial growth and all that kind of stuff. So some things have changed, but other things haven't.
Lydia, I mean, there are all kinds of analogies, and if this is a word, disanalogies to the 60s protests. But one that strikes me that people have mentioned is that the anti-war movement had chants that were, in retrospect, offensive, even though the cause was ultimately just and is now widely, if not universally, recognized as just. They would chant that one side's right, one side's wrong, we're on the side of the Viet Cong. But that didn't, I think, ultimately, by the judgment of history, discredit that movement. Similarly, there are things being said that, setting aside even an objective, if such a thing is possible, evaluation of their content, Jewish students on campus find not only inappropriate, but grossly so, and possibly even explicitly threatening to them and their safety. Your reporting bears this out. And in fact, you've said, to my mind, quite nuanced things about it. Could you address that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm always hesitant to sort of make a kind of blanket declaration about the intent of someone's speech, right? And then also about the way in which that speech is, internally received by another person. I talked to a lot of Jewish students on Columbia's campus, both, students who are participating in the protest in the encampment, and students, who met, for example, with House Speaker Mike Johnson, and then other students who just talked about, the feeling of just generalized discomfort that bordered on feeling threatened. And it's very hard to sort of draw a line between, like, I didn't speak to anybody who had experienced, direct violence against them or a threat of direct violence. I didn't speak to anyone who had, been on the receiving end of, an explicitly anti-Semitic remark or statement. But, it's clear that there is an atmosphere in which Jewish students, many of whom grew up, in contexts where being Jewish and supporting the Jewish state were really kind of married together, really experienced the what I think is a movement that's trying to separate those things and speak about them in different ways as deeply unsettling, sometimes offensive, and sometimes unsafe. And, I think you take that seriously, right? Like, this is a campus. It's a place where people are supposed to feel, challenged by complicated and difficult ideas, but in an environment where, their sort of physical safety is assured. Emotional safety, I think, is another question. And I think, that's something that has obviously been a huge kind of political football. How safe should anyone feel on a university campus is something we've been talking about for a very long time. But the thing that I also thought about, and I often do this when I report and write, is I just sort of think, like, well, how does this make me feel? And, I had one particular experience that didn't involve an anti-Semitic chant, but involved, this incident where a group of students, and this happened outside the police headquarters rather than on Columbia's campus, but a group of protesters had just completed an evening prayer, and there was a line of police officers who'd kind of lined up against a metal barricade, right? And there were these two police officers that were standing side by side, and as the evening prayer wrapped up, and there was a group of young men who, to my appearances, like they look like white men, which, there are plenty of white Muslims. So, I'm not saying anything about who they are or aren't, but they had clearly identified one of the police officers who, I couldn't see his name tag and I didn't, he wouldn't have spoken to me even if I tried. But he was a dark-skinned guy, but they seemed to think that his name was Muhammad and that he was a Muslim. And they just sort of started badgering him, like, how can you call yourself a Muslim and, and stand here, the 15,000, children in Gaza who've been killed. I think about them every night. May Allah forgive you, bro, that kind of thing. And that just sort of started to, kind of set me on edge. It just bothered me that they would go after this person in this way. And then they started in on a Black woman police officer who was standing next to him and talking about how her, ancestors had been colonized and enslaved, and how dare you be. And I just, there was something about this scene of these young white-seeming men going after these two people of color that I was just like, this is gross. Like, why are you doing this? This is not necessary. It undermines, what had been like the very warm and, I don't know, like peaceful feeling of, protesting and prayer with something that felt quite menacing. And so I guess, like, again, that's not an experience of anti-Semitism, but I thought, like, if I'm having this experience about people that I feel a sense of alignment with, I can imagine how other people might feel in that situation.
Yeah. And I think part of what makes protest powerful and makes it unsettling and makes it controversial and makes grownups, sometimes have irrational responses to it. Let's see if we can get through this segment without saying clutch or pearls, but is that they're chaotic. they're chaotic. They're disruptions of normal order. They're disruptions of norms and of peace and of the way things are. Even if they're peaceful, they're a warp in the fabric. And all kinds of people are attracted to that, from pure idealists and from, in the Columbia Spectator report, there were tales of the Passover Seder that was celebrated within the encampment and the kind of honoring of the Jewish tradition that was part of this protest. And, that's a kind of nuanced and subtle story that is not readily apparent if you're just seeing snippets on social media. And for, I think the set of people in the world, Jews and others, who find the tendency among some people protesting the atrocities in Gaza to kind of obviate or make light of or wave away the atrocities of October 7th, which is a real tendency in the discourse, both on campus and off, although far from a universal one. The way in which the general chaos of any kind of protest or disruption could feel attached to that dismissal of, Jewish personhood is totally, you could see how the menace you saw could be layered over for students in ways that would be difficult, which doesn't, prompt easy answers about what administrators should do about it. But I think that dynamic is real. And I think the best journalism about this captures it.
Well, and I think the other thing that just made me feel icky in general was the way in which kind of identity was tokenized kind of across the board, right? That there was this effort by Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, to kind of, only speak to a group of Jewish students and sort of tokenizing their identity in that way, and then, you'd go down to the camp and, it'd be like, oh, all the journalists want to talk to Jewish students who are participating in the encampment, and everyone is sort of offering up these kind of reductive ideas about identity in order to justify their or to build their position. And that also just felt kind of icky to me. And I think people aren't reducible to their DNA or their religion or their biography. And there is, and that sort of speaks to that kind of totalizing effect that I think protests can have, that it can feel very kind of flattening. But we also live in this time of just very intense polarization, and where everyone wants to simplify and shorthand. And, the complexity of things, which, leads to discomfort, is sort of left by the wayside.
Yeah. I mean, the liberating joy of the scapegoat is the one unifying fact of American political existence right now. Well, unflattening all of this and filling it with much needed nuances, Lydia Polgreen and her columns in the New York Times. I'm going to shout out too. The student-led protests aren't perfect. That doesn't mean they're not right, from April 26. Columbia Free Speech and the Coddling of the American Right from April 19th. They're both really remarkable pieces of journalism. Lydia, thank you so much for coming on the show. And please, the story is going nowhere, sadly, at least anytime soon. And any related story we'd love to talk to you about in the future. Please come back.
Such a pleasure.
This episode is brought to you by ZBiotics. There's now a game-changing product to use before a night out with drinks. It's called ZBiotics. Let's face it, after a night with drinks, it's tough to bounce back the next day. You have to make a choice. You can either have a great night or a great next day. ZBiotics is a surefire way to wake up feeling fresh after a night of drinking. ZBiotics pre-alcohol probiotic drink is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. ZBiotics produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. Just remember to make ZBiotics your first drink of the night, drink responsibly, and you'll feel your best tomorrow. Go to zbiotics.com/culture to get 15% off your first order when you use culture at checkout. ZBiotics is backed with 100% money-back guarantee. So if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/culture and use the code culture at checkout for 15% off.
All right. Now is the moment in our podcast when we endorse Dana. What do you have this week?
I actually thought of my endorsement while we were talking to Lydia Polgreen. One of the things that Lydia observed while reporting on the Columbia campus over the past few weeks was what she described as a group of students sitting around discussing a Palestinian poem. I think the poem she's referring to, because she mentions it in one of her pieces for the Times on this, is actually by Naomi Shihab Nye, who's a Palestinian American poet. The poem is called Kindness. It's a really famous poem, and I think one that is very easy to find online. But what I wanted to endorse is not just that poem, but Naomi Shihab Nye herself. She's actually been a big part of my life since I was a child, because she lived in San Antonio. I believe she still lives in San Antonio, where I grew up. And when I was a kid, she had this great position of the poet in the schools, where she would circulate to different schools and do poetry workshops with kids. And so probably 3 or 4 different times during my childhood, I would, spend an hour or two with Naomi Shihab Nye writing poetry and reading poetry. And she is just great. She's a wonderful teacher, wonderful poet, just a terrific person to know about in the world. And so one way to get to know her, besides just going into a poetry deep dive online, and her stuff is easy to find, is that she did an episode of On Being, the podcast On Being, with Krista Tippett. It was years ago now. I think I'm looking it up. It was 2016 that she appeared on that show. But one of the things she does on that show is read the poem Kindness, the one that was being read on the Columbia campus last week, and talk about the story behind it, and just sort of, talk about her life in poetry. So Naomi Shihab Nye, listen to her on Being, or just read her poetry online.
That sounds amazing. Julia, what do you have?
I have 2 things this week. The first is I just want to shout out our sometime guest and sometime Dana Movie Club guest, Justin Chang, my former colleague at the Los Angeles Times, who won a Pulitzer for criticism yesterday.
Yes, way to go, Justin. I saw that news and I was so thrilled for him. That's so wonderful.
He's just such a wonderful critic and such a wonderful person. And the portfolio of work that was honored was very strong, including his essays on Oppenheimer. It's just fun when good things happen to great people. Justin is now a film critic at The New Yorker. If you don't know his work, that's where you can check him out now. My endorsement this week is a fantastic book by one of the people I most admire in journalism, Adam Moss, the longtime legendary magazine editor who ran New York Magazine, ran the New York Times Magazine, has a new book out called The Work of Art, which is a series of detailed interviews with legendary artists across a wide variety of mediums about how, as he puts it, something comes from nothing. It's incredibly visual. It's essentially like a coffee table book that is a gigantic magazine package, because I think that's how Adam's brain works. There are footnotes and documents and, a picture of a shoebox full of the scraps that the cartoonist Roz Chast writes her indecipherable little scraps of ideas on, a long conversation with Tony Kushner about his agonized self-doubt, even now, after everything he's achieved. It's unputdownable, totally fascinating, incredibly dense, and wonderful. So I strongly, strongly recommend The Work of Art by Adam Moss.
Yeah, that does sound amazing. All right, well, how often do you see a discography laid out like this one? Debut album in the mid-1950s, I think justly iconic, self-titled album, gets 5 stars in all the common review places in 1955. And then the next record in the discography comes out in 1985. A 30-year silence from the saxophonist Frank Morgan, a jazz giant in the making in the Charlie Parker mold in the 1950s, a bop saxophonist. And the hopes could not have been higher for Frank Morgan, but he was a heroin addict and he was in and out of prison for those 30 years. And he cleaned up, went straight, got out of jail permanently in the early to mid 80s, and began recording again. Frank Morgan's output since the 1980s has been voluminous and of the absolutely highest order. His playing was utterly beautiful. He'd moved beyond bop. It doesn't sound like any kind of a retread or throwback. He made 2 albums back to back in the early 90s that at the time I was totally enamored with. One of them, You Must Believe in Spring, I just played endlessly. I love that record. I more recently rediscovered what I thought was my second favorite of those 2, and now may be my favorite. It's called Listen to the Dawn. And it's, I think, the only record Morgan has ever cut without a pianist. Instead, there's Kenny Burrell on guitar. I think it's a quartet, though some cuts might be a trio. Julia, I have a habit of like dropping off little jazz offerings to you, and they tend to feature piano because of our shared love of Red Garland. I would really highly recommend this record. You just start with the title cut, Listen to the Dawn, is incredible, or the final cut on it, Goodbye. But it's just a beautiful, beautiful album, and the story is so astonishing. 30 years of no recording and in and out of jail.
Oh, I'm so excited. I will definitely check that out. I feel like I have not yet thanked you, Steve, but I will thank you here now for any of our listeners who might be under the misimpression that you're a curmudgeon rather than a softie. But you made a beautiful jazz mix for me when I was helping tend to some family obligations recently, and it's wonderful. So thank you for that too.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, we can link to that also if people want to hear it. I have to say, I love it.
I love the albums you recommend, but this is a good little blender tour.
Well, thank you, Julia. What a fun show.
Indeed.
Thanks, Dana.
Thanks, Steve.
You will find links to some of the things we talked about today at our show page. That's slate.com/culturefest, and you can email us at culturefest@slate.com. Our introductory music is by the composer Nicholas Bertel. Our production assistant is Kat Hong. Our producer is Jared Downing. For Dana Stevens and Julia Turner, I'm Stephen Metcalf. Thank you so much for joining us. We will see you soon.